Happy Sunday and welcome to your weekly news recap. I'm Gabriela Perez and here are the top stories of the week. Kicking off the week with some disturbing news, free speech is now under attack. Criticism of Israel on college campuses can soon be illegal in the middle of a global movement against Israel's crimes on Palestine. All federally funded schools, including K-12 and college education, would have to make sure the state of Israel is not criticized on their property. So saying things like Israel oppresses Palestine or Israel is a colonial project would violate Title VI, putting the school at risk of losing its federal funding. Title VI is already something schools have to follow because of the fear of losing federal funding, but adding this to Title VI is a violation of free speech, especially considering that in statements from other sponsors of the bill, they all mention college protests in a time when pro-Palestine protests have spread throughout the nation. The new legislation that passed the House with 320 votes in favor and 91 votes against is trying to redefine anti-Semitism. Legislation titled H.R. 69, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, is changing the definition of anti-Semitism to one that states that claiming the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor and therefore is anti-Semitic. The author of the bill is Mike Lawler, who has received almost $200,000 this year alone from the biggest pro-Israel lobbying group in the US, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. The bill is pushed heavily by pro-Israel lobbies in our government because it literally grants them protection from criticism, as many of the criticisms they face are based off on the actions of the state of Israel. Pro-Israel lobbies in our government have donated millions to politicians, with the biggest contributor being AIPAC, which donated over $3 million to politicians just last year. The bill is now headed to the Senate, then President Biden's desk. Next, pro-Israel mobs attacked UCLA students while they were peacefully protesting for 3 hours before the LAPD got involved. At 10 p.m. on Tuesday, the pro-Israel mob had gathered at UCLA campus attempting to provoke the UCLA students who held an encampment in favor of Palestine by sounding crying babies on their speakers and trying to take down the wooden barricades students had created to protect themselves. Pro-Palestine protesters were ordered not to engage with the pro-Israeli mob and held their ground for 3 hours. While the attack escalated, UCLA pro-Palestine protesters were getting trampled and beaten with sticks and mobs of people. Soon, tear gas and pepper spray were used by the attackers, while fireworks and other sprays were used against students. The pro-Israel mob was constantly yelling slurs, and most of them weren't even students, as they had stormed campus hours before the attack. 25 pro-Palestine protesters were hospitalized, suffering injuries from the pro-Israeli attackers. Pro-Palestine protests are still ongoing worldwide, with 120 universities now protesting all over the US. And at least one protest is happening in every continent of the world. All over universities, there have been clashes with police and with counter-protesters who resort to violence over college students. Moving on to some international news, the International Criminal Court is preparing to issue Israel's Prime Minister an arrest warrant, but the US is already working to block them. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, along with 2 other government officials, can soon be served a warrant for their harsh response to Gaza from the October 7 attacks on Israel, including the death of over 34,000 Palestinians. They could also be accused of preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. Neither Israel nor the United States recognizes the court's jurisdiction, but any warrants would put Israeli officials at risk of arrest in other countries, including most of Europe. They would also serve as a high-profile statement on Israel's actions in Gaza and an embarrassing stance that would put Netanyahu alongside Russian President Vladimir Putin as a major leader to face such action from the ICC. It's not yet clear how the US would intervene the ICC, but the most likely route is backroom diplomacy, which means the US and the ICC would have to come up with an agreement away from the public's view. A spokesperson for Justice Democrats said the ICC is doing their job, which is to hold people accountable for international crimes and war crimes, which the Netanyahu regime and senior members of that government have been doing for months. I would question as to why anyone thinks the ICC does not have jurisdiction over the exact sort of crimes that they are supposed to have jurisdiction over, or why those governments who are not part of the ICC have any say as to who is or isn't part of the jurisdiction. Ending on a positive story, transgender health must be paid by state insurance in North Carolina and West Virginia. The Federal Appeals Court ruled on Monday that state insurance plans must provide coverage for gender-affirming care in North Carolina and West Virginia. Trans advocates say it's a huge victory, especially since bills restricting the rights of transgender people have been on the rise in state legislators. In an 8-6 decision, the majority of the Fourth Circuit decided from 2 cases that transgender people were entitled to health insurance coverage for their care. Judge Roger Gregory called the denial of coverage obviously discriminatory. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, Virginia issued its decision from 2 cases. One was brought by North Carolina state employees and their dependents who are transgender and were unable to get coverage for gender-affirming care. The other lawsuit came from West Virginians who are transgender and on Medicaid. They would get coverage for some treatments like hormones, but not for surgery. In oral arguments, the judges asked about mastectomies. As an example, those were covered by patients with breast cancer, but they were not covered by the health insurance plans for transgender patients. And that's all for this week. From politics to crime, I look forward to giving you independent coverage every week. Subscribe and follow my social media pages to catch up on the latest news. I'll see you next week.